For almost 30 years, the United States has failed to pass meaningful federal legislation responding to the threat of climate change. Sooner or later, the United States will have to reconcile U.S. law on climate change with a growing body of law that has been developing during the last 30 years at the international level. The purpose of this video is to identify elements of the architecture of international climate change law that has developed over the last 25 years, in which the United States will sooner or later have to comply with or at least respond to. It also, we will look at why climate change is an ethical issue and why there are ethical issues that need to be considered in structuring domestic U.S. climate change law. Before looking at the international climate change regime, we first take a look at why climate change must be understood as an ethical problem. This chart shows on the top high-emitting nations and on the bottom countries which are victims of climate change. Climate change must be understood as a civilization-challenging ethical question because it is high-emitting countries in one part of the world that are putting poor countries and poor people in other parts of the world at great risk. The second reason why climate change must be understood as a civilization-challenging ethical problem stems from the fact that the harms to the victims are not mere inconveniences, they are harsh, catastrophic impacts in terms of droughts, floods, inability to grow crops to sustain oneself, vector-borne disease, and other harsh impacts. The third reason why climate change must be understood as a civilization-challenging ethical questions comes from the fact that the victims, the people who are at risk, can't petition their governments to protect them. Their only hope is that high-emitting people and nations will see that they not only have interests, but they have duties, responsibilities, and obligations. We begin our examination of the existing legal structure on climate change by noting that since 1990, all the countries of the world have been meeting to put into place a climate structure and strategy. The most important meeting was in 1992 when the international community adopted the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Every year since then, countries have been meeting to fill out some of the details under this treaty. Not all years in which the international parties have met are equally as important. We now begin with the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on the Climate Change, which included many important provisions of the architecture, including the provision that nations, including the United States, have duties to not cause damage to the environment of other states beyond their jurisdiction. The United States also agreed that the ultimate objective of this convention is to stabilize greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at levels that prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Under the Framework Convention, the United States and other countries agreed to reduce their emissions based upon equity and common but differentiated responsibilities. Notice these are ethical principles of distributive justice. They do not say that countries can base their emissions reductions on self-interest, but have a duty to base it upon equity. The United States, along with other parties, also agreed that scientific uncertainty will not be used as an excuse for taking actions and measures required under the Climate Change Convention. And so the U.S. agreed not to use scientific uncertainty as an excuse for non-action. The United States also agreed to adopt policies and measures necessary to achieve the goals of the convention was the prevention of dangerous climate change. And again agreed that developed countries should take the lead in this effort. Although the original climate change treaty had no enforceable targets, by 1995 it was clear, the science was clear, that it was time for nations to agree to enforceable emissions limitations. And in 1997, the international community agreed to the Kyoto Protocol, in which 37 countries committed themselves to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by specific targets. The Kyoto Protocol also includes several new positions not contained in the original treaty, including 3 trading mechanisms: emissions trading, something called the Clean Development Mechanism, and something called joint implementation. And so under the Kyoto Protocol, all developed countries, including the United States, agreed to emissions reduction targets. The United States initially refused to ratify the treaty, and finally, when George Bush came into office, he withdrew the United States from the Kyoto Protocol. The United States would be the only country that originally did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol emissions reductions were to be achieved between the year 2008 and 2012. Thus, the provisions of the Kyoto Protocol ceased to exist after the year 2012. Because the Kyoto Protocol's emissions reductions ceased to exist after 2012, in 2007 the international community agreed to a negotiating process to replace the Kyoto targets in something called the Bali Roadmap. The Bali Roadmap was a promise to negotiate a second commitment period under the United Nations Treaty. The Bali Roadmap provided that the second commitment period would be finalized in Copenhagen in 2009. In 2009, the international community agreed on many aspects of a second commitment period, including provisions relating to emissions reductions, verifications of emissions, and how to protect forests. Under the Copenhagen Accords, all nations also agreed to work together to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade. They also agreed to fund adaptation and financing poor nations' activities under the treaty. Although Copenhagen was seen to be a small step forward by many countries, to others it was a bitter disappointment because it didn't create legally binding enforceable emissions reduction targets, nor did it provide adequate funding for adaptation and other needs of victim developing countries. This chart demonstrates why it would be foolish to allow warming to exceed 2 degrees above current levels. The darker the red line, the higher the probability that there will be rapid, nonlinear, harsh climate impacts to food, water, ecological systems. In Cancun, the year after Copenhagen, no major changes were made in the magnitude of voluntary emissions. However, countries were urged to upgrade their commitments, something which has not yet been done for the most part. In Cancun, countries also agreed to mobilize $100 billion a year in public and private finance to assist developing countries with a variety of things they need to be concerned with from climate change. Cancun also made progress on financing adaptation in developing countries and reducing deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries. Last year in Durban, the international community also agreed to negotiate by 2015 a binding agreement to replace the Kyoto Protocol, and that agreement would become effective by 2020. The international community also agreed in Durban to provide dedicated sources of funding for adaptation in developing countries and to assist developing countries respond to climate change through adequate financing. Despite agreeing to 2 degrees centigrade limits, when one looked at the voluntary commitments made pursuant to Copenhagen, one finds out that the countries were not willing to reduce emissions at levels necessary to prevent 2 degrees centigrade. The United States agreed to a 17% reduction below 2005, which is only a 4% reduction below 1990. This chart shows that if all the voluntary commitments made pursuant to Copenhagen and Durban were achieved, the world would experience a 3.9 degrees centigrade temperature rise, far above the 2 degrees centigrade rise that is necessary to prevent catastrophic warming. And so countries need to dramatically increase their commitments to emissions reductions. This chart shows that the United States, on a per capita basis, is by far one of the world's largest polluters of greenhouse gases. Yet the U.S. commitment was the weakest of all the developed countries under the Copenhagen Accords. We now turn to what the U.S. must do to conform its U.S. domestic law to the international climate change architecture, as well as deal with several ethical issues that have yet to be faced by the international community. One, the United States must reduce its emissions to levels in combinations with others will prevent 2 degrees centigrade warming. It must also agree to emissions reductions that, based upon equity, represent the U.S. fair share of safe global emissions. The U.S. also must provide funding to assist poor nations in adaptation needs and other needs, including deforestation effort. This chart shows the steepness of the curves necessary to prevent 2 degrees centigrade rising. This is truly a civilization-challenging problem. At the top of the list of the things the United States must do is commit to far greater emissions reductions than currently under consideration. Concluding, because climate change is an ethical problem, the United States must make sure that its policies are based upon duties, not self-interest, assess poor countries with adaptation needs, and make sure its commitments are equal to the task of stabilizing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at safe levels.